My sunflower violated community harmony, and my porch light was apparently visually aggressive. That's not satire. That's HOA enforcement under Queen Karen of Oak Ridge. She fined my bird bath, trimmed my tree, and declared war on my lawn. But when she tried to tear down my fence, that's when the landlord and me woke up. I never thought a sunflower could start a war, but here we are. It was a bright little thing, just one tall stalk with a cheerful yellow bloom that had the audacity to grow beside my porch without submitting a formal landscaping proposal. I didn't even mean to plant it, really. I'd spilled some birdseed last spring, and the damn thing just popped up like it owned the place. I figured it was a good omen. After 35 years of inspecting building codes, writing up citations, and negotiating land disputes, I had finally retired to my father's old cabin in Hickory Bend, Oregon. He'd bought the entire 60-acre plot back in 1980 with the idea of building something simple, a small cooperative community near Maple Hollow Lake, where neighbors looked out for each other, and no one gave a damn what shade of beige your mailbox was. For a while, it actually worked. Then came Lydia Simmons. Blonde bob, permanent sunglasses, always smelled like citrus and control issues. She moved in 2 lots down about 3 years ago and wasted no time ascending to the top of the HOA food chain. The first time I met her, she didn't knock, she didn't wave, she didn't even say hello. She just marched up my porch like she was conducting a compliance raid on a rogue flower cartel, clipboard in hand, lips tight, in a smile that said, "Bless your heart," but meant you're already guilty. She looked down at the sunflower, back at me, then said, "Mr. Jacobs, unauthorized vegetation violates Section 4C of our community appearance guidelines. You'll need to remove it within 48 hours or face an enforcement notice." I blinked. "It's a flower," I said. She tilted her head like my logic had personally offended her ancestors. Now, maybe if I'd been new here, I might have smiled politely and yanked it out, but I wasn't new. I wasn't some weekend lake guy who needed a permit to sneeze on his lawn furniture. This land wasn't just where I lived, it was mine. My father had leased 50 acres of it to the HOA for a symbolic $1 a year. It was an act of goodwill, a gesture of community trust. The other 10 acres, including my cabin, sat just outside HOA jurisdiction. At least on paper. I'd never bothered to change the terms, never needed to, until now. I told her no, not angrily, not sarcastically, just plainly, that flower stays. Leedy's smile tightened. She tapped her pen against her clipboard like she was about to write me out of existence. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel. I watched her walk away, her white heels clicking against the gravel like a slow countdown to something absurd. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment things started. Not with a bang, not with a protest, just a sunflower and a woman who thought her HOA badge came with divine authority. What I didn't expect was how fast it would escalate. Within 3 days, I got my first notice. Improper vehicle placement. My old Ford pickup, same spot it'd sat in for years, was now disrupting visual harmony. 2 days later, unauthorized wooden structure. The bench by the lake, the one I built to remember my father, now apparently threatened community safety. Lydia never came herself. She sent notices, emails, and once even left a laminated friendly reminder taped to my bird feeder. But the worst part wasn't the paper trail. It was the smile she wore every time she passed my property. That knowing little grin like she'd already won, like this land was hers and I was just renting space from her ego. And maybe I wouldn't have cared. Maybe I would have laughed it off like I had with so many petty officials during my career. But the moment she tried to tell me what I could and couldn't grow on soil my father bled into, well, that was the moment she planted something far more dangerous than a flower. She planted a fight. And I was just getting started. You'd think that after a passive-aggressive flower standoff, things would cool down. Maybe a polite standoff, a few cold stares at the mailbox, and then we'd all move on with our HOA-approved lives. But Lydia Simmons wasn't the type to move on. She was the type to dig in. Heels first, rules in hand, and clipboard raised like a sword of neighborhood justice. Within a month, she'd done more than just double down. She'd crowned herself the unofficial queen of Oak Ridge, and her throne was the folding chair outside the HOA clubhouse where she held court every Saturday morning, sipping cucumber water and plotting like a suburban Napoleon. The problem wasn't just her obsession with order. It was her belief that everyone else owed her allegiance. Under Lydia's reign, new community enhancements began rolling out faster than Amazon Prime. The first was a list of visual pollutants, a phrase she invented and trademarked in HOA minutes, which included everything from mismatched patio furniture to lawn gnomes with facial expressions deemed overly whimsical. Soon after, she launched what she called the HOA Task Force, a trio of equally overbearing volunteers who patrolled the neighborhood in neon orange polos, armed with measuring tape, digital cameras, and the kind of self-importance usually reserved for mall cops or minor royalty. Residents started whispering behind closed blinds. One woman was fined for her wind chimes being too tonal. Another got cited for her garden hose being coiled counterclockwise. And every new rule was passed with a unanimous vote by a board Lydia had handpicked from her wine club. I kept my head down for a while, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. Watching her work was like observing an invasive species establish dominance. Her emails arrived with alarming frequency, subject lines in all caps. Reminder, no curtains, visible from street, urgent, relocate decorative rocks. Then came the flyers. She taped one to my front gate titled Understanding Compliance Through Aesthetic Harmony, a 7-page manifesto that included diagrams, color charts, and a threatening note about mailbox alignment. I laughed at first. Then she fined me $250, 0 cents, for having unregistered outdoor lighting. The lamp on my porch, the same one that's been there since 1991. Apparently, the new regulation prohibited exposed bulb designs evocative of rural disrepair. I couldn't make this stuff up. But it wasn't just the citations, it was the control. One afternoon, I watched her stand in front of my neighbor's house for 6 minutes, silently judging a flower bed. No notes, no photos, just staring, like she was absorbing the sin of hydrangeas that were a shade too enthusiastic. People started acting differently. Smiles turned to nods, nods to nothing. Conversations dried up like overwatered begonias. The message was clear. If Lydia didn't approve of you, neither should anyone else. She was turning neighbors into silent soldiers, watching, reporting, complying. And the worst part? Most folks just went along with it, because when it comes to HOAs, it's easier to smile and nod than it is to stand up and say, "What the hell is this?" Still, I waited, I documented every notice, every email, every photo. 35 years in land enforcement had taught me something Lydia hadn't counted on. I knew how to spot a paper trail when someone was digging their own grave with it. And with every passive-aggressive memo and every selectively enforced policy, she was stacking up kindling without realizing someone nearby owned a match. I wasn't interested in petty payback. I was interested in patterns, specifically how one woman with a clipboard and a complex could twist a peaceful community into a fear-driven HOA regime. What Lydia didn't know, and what no one else could see yet, was that she'd already made her first critical mistake. Not the fines, not the emails, not even the flyers stapled to my pine tree. No, the moment she created a task force to enforce compliance, she put her entire HOA empire on paper. And paper, well, it burns. The only question left was how big the fire would get. It didn't take long for Lydia's paper empire to start raining down like unsolicited coupons. Within a week of her compliance task force announcement, I received my first stack of citations, hand-delivered, color-coded, and laminated because, God forbid, petty tyranny arrive unprofessionally. The first one was for vehicle disruption. My old Ford pickup, parked beside my cabin like it had been for 3 decades, was now allegedly interfering with neighborhood symmetry. I stared at the wording for a full minute, trying to figure out if I had fallen into a parody of Suburbia or a particularly dull episode of Twilight Zone HOA edition. The fine, $200, 0 cents. The note, consider repositioning vehicle to align with visual intent, whatever the hell that meant. 2 days later, a notice appeared, taped to my bird bath of all places, for unauthorized structural additions. It referred to a wooden bench I'd built near the lake, a bench for sitting. I built it with my own hands, sealed it with linseed oil, and etched my father's initials into the leg. Lydia's task force had apparently deemed it a safety hazard. citing non-compliant railings and lack of standardized form. The fine, $300, 0 cents. By Friday, I was fined again, this time for my cabin's natural wood exterior, which had apparently become too organic for modern neighborhood standards. Please repaint structure using a tone from the approved HOA palette, the citation read. Earth tones must evoke serenity, not rusticity. I didn't know whether to scream or frame it. The flood of nonsense didn't stop at paper. Lydia was ramping up theatrics. She posted an open letter on the HOA bulletin board, complete with bullet points and a photo of herself looking authoritative under soft lighting, claiming that certain residents were posing ongoing risks to communal values. She never used my name, but the subtlety of a brick in a gift bag. That weekend, I caught one of her task force members slowly circling my property with a measuring wheel and a GoPro strapped to his chest like he was surveying a crime scene. When I stepped outside, he waved awkwardly and shouted, "Routine measurement, no cause for concern." I asked what he was measuring. He said, boundary vibes. The worst part wasn't the citations or the fines. It was the quiet. My neighborhood, once a place of potlucks and porch conversations, had turned cold. Mrs. Delaney, who used to bring over banana bread, now looked away when I waved. Tom, from 2 doors down, stopped inviting me to his weekend fish fries. One morning, I found a flyer on my doormat titled Neighborhood Harmony, recognizing disruptive elements. On the bottom corner was a photo of someone's house blurred out mine. It was subtle psychological warfare, and it was working. Not because I was losing, but because Lydia had figured out something even more powerful than rules, shame. And she was distributing it like a coupon booklet, frequent, free, and soul-crushing. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just collecting fines, I was collecting patterns, timestamps, contradictions, instances where citations were applied to me but not to others, one neighbor's porch light that looked like mine went untouched, a car parked in the same style as mine wasn't cited. The more inconsistently she enforced, the clearer the abuse of power became, and every inconsistency was another page in the case I was quietly building. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation, I was preparing for an audit, because when someone builds a kingdom on fear and favoritism, the only thing they fear more than a challenge is a spotlight. Lydia's next move, however, wouldn't just cross the line, it would torch it. And for the first time in my life, I'd understand what it meant to be targeted, not by a system, but by a person with just enough power and far too much time. I knew it was coming, some escalation, some manufactured emergency that would push Lydia's power trip into overdrive, but I didn't expect it to arrive wrapped in flashing lights and municipal authority. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd just finished trimming a few branches near the porch when 2 county deputies pulled into my gravel driveway, calm, courteous, and already wearing the weary look of men who had been dragged into neighborhood nonsense more than once this month. One introduced himself as Deputy Alvarez and asked if I was Henry Jacobs. I said yes. He sighed like a man who just found out he'd stepped into HOA theater and couldn't find the exit. Apparently, Lydia had filed a complaint claiming I had verbally threatened her with hostile intent during a discussion about my non-compliant lighting fixtures, which, to be clear, was a conversation that consisted of me saying, "I don't think a porch lamp is worth a constitutional crisis." I invited the officers to look at my security footage. The video showed Lydia standing 5 feet from me, frowning, while I gently held a watering can and explained the concept of property rights like I was on a PBS show for toddlers. Deputy Alvarez watched silently, then chuckled under his breath. "You've got a good security system," he said. "We've seen a few of these overzealous complaint calls lately." Translation, this wasn't their first Karen rodeo. But despite clearing my name, the damage was done. You see, when a sheriff's car parks in front of your house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it might as well be a parade float. Curtains twitch, phones buzz, rumors write themselves faster than truth can catch up. The next morning, I noticed a post on the Oak Ridge community page titled, "Concern for Safety." It was from Lydia, of course, warning residents to remain vigilant about escalating behavioral disruptions from certain individuals. No names, again, just enough breadcrumbs to let everyone fill in the blanks with their own paranoia. I was no longer just the guy who refused to repaint his porch. I was the HOA's designated neighborhood threat. And then things got weirder. One of Lydia's task force cronies started jogging past my house twice a day wearing a body cam. Another left a compliance courtesy card under my windshield wiper with a smiley face and the phrase, "We're watching for your wellness." It was like living in a psychological thriller written by an intern with a control complex. A few days later, I found a laminated sign staked in my lawn that read, "Designated Observation Property, HOA Active Monitoring Zone." It wasn't just enforcement anymore, it was performance. Lydia was staging theater for the neighborhood, with me cast as the villain in her little soap opera. But the tipping point came when she weaponized landscaping. I returned from a supply run one morning to find the lower limbs of my old oak tree trimmed badly, unevenly, and obviously by someone with no clue how trees work. Nearby, the community grounds crew was packing up. One of them sheepishly told me Lydia had claimed the branches were interfering with communal sunlight access. The tree was clearly on my private property, but Lydia's interpretation of common influence zones now extended 10 feet past reality. That night, I poured a glass of bourbon, sat on my porch, and watched the wind whip through the place where those branches used to hang. She wasn't just playing politics anymore. She was testing how far she could reach before someone told her no. And she was about to find out exactly how far that reach went, right up to the edge of criminal liability, because what Lydia did next didn't just cross another boundary, it bulldozed it. It happened on a Saturday morning, early enough that the fog still clung to the grass like the place was holding its breath. I'd made a quick trip into town, just 30 minutes to pick up mulch and coffee, and when I pulled back onto my property, I knew something was wrong before I even stepped out of the truck. The silence was too clean. No birdsong, no breeze rustling the oak branches, just a stillness that warned you in its own quiet way, something has been taken. The first thing I saw was the fence. My handmade garden fence, built from cedar posts my father and I milled ourselves lay in a twisted pile. Splinters scattered across the lawn like someone had tried to murder the idea of craftsmanship. Then I saw the sunflower, or more accurately, the jagged stump where it used to be, torn clean out of the ground, roots and all, like it was some weed that had violated zoning laws. And just in case I was confused about who had done it, there was a notice duct taped to my front door in red. Final strike, 72 hours to remove all non-compliant structures or face forced action under Section 7B. I didn't need to check the cameras, but I did. What they showed was Lydia Simmons standing at the edge of my property in her signature pink windbreaker, barking orders like a director on a low-budget crime show. 3 men in fluorescent vests, landscaping crew, probably contractors, moved across my yard, tearing down my fence piece by piece, while she pointed with her clipboard like a general mapping an invasion. At one point, as they yanked the sunflower from its soil, Lydia said, clear as day, "If he wants flowers, he can get them at a cemetery." One of the crew laughed. The other two just looked uncomfortable. I paused the footage and stared at the screen for a long time. Not angry, not even surprised, just certain. That was it. That was the moment, the shift from civil annoyance to actual prosecutable destruction. No more gray areas, no more clever citations or interpretive rules. Lydia had crossed the line from irritating to illegal and left behind enough evidence to wrap herself in it like a weighted blanket. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and walked down to the basement where a fireproof safe held everything my father had ever signed, stamped, or notarized about this land. Contracts, maps, the original lease to the HOA. I pulled the files out with a calm that surprised even me. Somewhere in there, buried beneath decades of good intentions, was the clause Lydia had never bothered to ask about, the one that gave me the power to remind her, this land is. That afternoon, I made one phone call to Evelyn Brooks, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. She answered on the second ring. "Henry," she said, "what took you so long?" I smiled. I needed to let the weeds show themselves. She laughed like a woman who already knew this was going to be fun. And that's when the plan began to bloom, quietly, methodically, and with the promise that this time it wouldn't be a sunflower she'd have to fear. It'd be something far more permanent. Evelyn Brooks didn't waste time with small talk. By the time I arrived at her office, an unassuming brick building nestled behind a bakery that smelled like cinnamon and secrets, she already had the original lease agreement spread out across her oak desk, annotated with enough sticky notes to make a judge weep. "This contract," she said, tapping the page like it had personally offended her, "is a sledgehammer and Lydia's standing under the chandelier. I smiled because I knew exactly what she meant. The lease my father had signed in 1980 allowed the HOA to operate on 50 acres of our land for $1 per year. It was an act of goodwill, but buried in the fine print was a clause that allowed for full market adjustment with 30 days' notice, triggered automatically if any part of the agreement was violated. Guess what? Property destruction counted. We pulled up comparable land assessments for Hickory Bend. 50 acres of lake-adjacent property, roughly $12,000, 0 cents per acre, annually. That made the fair market lease value a modest $600,000, 0 cents per year. Evelyn wrote up the rent adjustment notice like she was drafting a love letter to karma. "We'll overnight this," she said, sealing it in an envelope with a smirk. "Let's see if the queen enjoys paying taxes on a castle she doesn't actually own." But we weren't done, not by a long shot. Next came the audit. HOA bylaws, expenditure reports, voting records, the things most committees assume are just boring paperwork, but that people like Lydia treat like blank checks with fine print nobody reads. What we found was a goldmine of mismanagement. HOA fees had doubled over the past year, from $150, 0 cents, to $300, 0 cents per month, with no recorded vote. A community park renovation fund had been funneled almost entirely into landscape enhancements at Lydia's own property. Custom pavers, a private koi pond, and a ridiculous floral arch she claimed was for events. Even the clubhouse was technically illegal. Half of it had been built over a property line that clearly belonged to me. "She's not just running an HOA," Evelyn muttered, flipping through the receipts. "She's running a petty fiefdom on borrowed land." The best part, though, came from a manila envelope I hadn't expected. That morning, Pastor Greg, Lydia's husband, showed up at my porch. He looked 10 years older than he had last week, eyes sunken, voice low. "Mr. Jacobs, I can't stay quiet anymore," he said, handing me the envelope. "She's gone too far, and I can't be part of it." Inside, printed emails, screenshots of text messages, even HOA board correspondence showing Lydia had forged signatures and bullied dissenting members into silence. She'd altered voting records, threatened neighbors with made-up infractions, and, this part made Evelyn laugh out loud, used HOA funds to buy official president attire from a designer boutique downtown. We now had everything: the motive, the paper trail, the financial records, and the footage, more than enough for a civil suit, possibly even a criminal case. Evelyn began drafting a lawsuit for property destruction, harassment, and breach of contract, while I prepared the formal notice to increase the HOA's rent. It wasn't revenge, it was rectification, a reminder that just because you shout the loudest doesn't mean you're in charge. Sometimes the quiet guy with a bird feeder and a dusty legal file is the one holding the deed. But we weren't going to serve papers just yet. No, we were going to let Liddy walk into her own downfall. Because if she thought paperwork was power, she was about to learn what happens when the paper bites back. And the timing couldn't have been better. Because a community meeting was coming up, one where I planned to speak, not as the man with the fines, but as the landlord with the microphone. I waited exactly 29 days, not because I had to, but because I wanted the 30th to hit like thunder. During that time, Lydia strutted through the neighborhood like nothing had changed. She posted new compliance reminders on the HOA bulletin board, fined a family for hosting a barbecue with unapproved charcoal, and even introduced a new policy banning emotionally chaotic holiday decorations. She was sharpening the blade with which she'd ruled for 3 years, unaware it was about to snap back and cut her down to size. The day before the HOA's quarterly community meeting, I sent out an official notice to all 83 households. Emergency addendum to meeting agenda, property ownership and governance discussion. It was brief, boring on the surface, but enough to stir every roomer in Oak Ridge into a frenzy. By 6:30 p.m. the next evening, the community hall was packed, standing room only. You could feel the buzz in the air, that perfect cocktail of confusion, curiosity, and the subtle hope that someone, somewhere, was about to say what no one else dared. At 7:00 sharp, Lydia entered. She wore a navy blazer with a gold HOA president pin and carried a binder so thick it looked like it had eaten smaller binders. She walked up to the podium, offered a tight smile, and began her usual spiel about community integrity and ongoing beautification initiatives. She tried to control the room the way she always did. Measured tone, veiled threats, faux warmth. But this time, the audience wasn't nodding. They were watching, waiting. When she opened the floor for other business, I stood up, walked slowly to the front, and plugged my laptop into the projector. The first slide was simple, a scanned copy of the 1980 lease agreement with one clause highlighted in yellow. I introduced myself again, not just as Henry Jacobs, the guy with the sunflower, but as the owner of all 50 acres the HOA currently occupied. I read the clause aloud. Lease may be terminated or adjusted to fair market rate with 30 days notice upon breach of any provision. Then I clicked to the next slide, a photo of Lydia standing next to the men tearing down my fence. Time-stamped, her voice clearly captured, ordering them to strip that mess out. You could hear the inhale ripple through the room like a wave. Effective immediately, I said calmly, the annual lease for HOA use of this land is increasing from $1 to $600,000, payable within 60 days. Additionally, I have filed civil action for destruction of personal property, harassment, and financial misconduct. Lydia tried to speak, but I raised a hand. I'm not done. Click. Financial records appeared. HOA fees doubled without votes. Landscaping invoices linked directly to Lydia's address. Click. HOA emails showing Lydia threatening residents who questioned her. Click. A spreadsheet of forged signatures from the last 3 board elections. Then came the kicker. Pastor Greg, her own husband, walked quietly to the podium and placed a folder next to my laptop. I'm sorry, he said to the room. I let it go on too long. He turned to me. Mr. Jacobs, thank you for standing up when the rest of us didn't. The room was silent, stunned. Then Mrs. Delaney, the banana bread lady who'd once stopped waving at me, stood up and said, I was afraid of you. Not because of anything you did, but because of what she said about you. I owe you an apology. That opened the floodgates. Tom from the fish fries, she fined me $400, 0 cents for letting my kid draw chalk on the driveway. Lisa Park, a single mother of 2, she told me if I didn't vote for her, my kids wouldn't be allowed at the playground anymore. The stories poured out, faces flushed with anger, tears, relief. Some people laughed bitterly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Lydia's face shifted from furious to pale to something approaching broken. You're all being manipulated, she said through clenched teeth. I've protected this community, a voice from the back shouted. No, you policed it like it was your property, another added. You ruled it like a HOA Hunger Games. And then the chant began, soft at first, then louder. Vote her out. We held the vote right then and there. Of 83 households, 76 voted to immediately remove Lydia from all HOA positions. 5 abstained, 2 voted to keep her. One was her own house. The other was someone who admitted they just didn't read the packet. And she didn't storm out. That would have given her dignity. She packed her binder, her pen, and her ego into a canvas tote bag that read, Lead with Integrity, and left in silence, her heels clicking down the hall like fading threats. For the first time since she arrived, no one followed her. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. Because taking down the queen was only half the battle. What we needed next wasn't just justice. It was rebirth. And that started with rebuilding not rules, but trust. In the days following Lydia's fall, Oak Ridge Ridge felt like a neighborhood waking up from a 3-year fog. People emerged from their houses as if blinking into sunlight for the first time. Porch lights turned on, barbecue grills reappeared, and laughter returned to backyards that had once been silent under the weight of aesthetic enforcement. It wasn't just about one woman stepping down. It was about a collective sigh of relief, the sense that we had survived something ridiculous together and were ready to stop surviving and start living. He called an emergency session the next week, not for punishments or drama, but for something far more important, reinvention. Mrs. Delaney was unanimously voted interim HOA president. She accepted the role with a laugh and a promise to keep things simple and keep her clipboard in a drawer. Lisa Park became secretary. Tom was made treasurer, humbled, steady, volunteered as the community ombudsman, determined to atone for the silence he once kept. Rodeo Weiner I declined any formal title, but accepted the role of land consultant, which was their way of saying, please make sure we don't accidentally violate your lease again. Together, we rewrote the bylaws. Gone were the obscure rules about curtain lengths and the number of visible garden ornaments. In their place, we focused on transparency, fairness, and actual community needs. All fines were frozen pending review. A third-party auditor was brought in, and HOA dues slashed from $300, 0 cents, back down to $150, 0 cents, with every expense now publicly posted online in what Lisa dubbed the shame-free spreadsheet. The first time in years, people weren't afraid to ask questions. They were encouraged to. We also declared a new community holiday, Sunflower Sunday, held on the first weekend of May to honor the ridiculous little flower that started it all. Kids helped plant a patch of sunflowers in the community park, and someone painted a wooden sign that read, "Grown with permission and spite." It got a lot of laughs, even more photos. As for Lydia, she left town quietly. Word had it she moved in with her sister in Arizona, where she'd joined another HOA, but this time as a regular member. A local reporter ran a follow-up story about our neighborhood's transformation, and within days, we had emails from other communities asking how we did it. Not just how we got rid of a tyrant, but how we turned her fall into something lasting, something better. Now, every time I step out onto my porch, I see the sunflower bed stretching along the edge of the fence line. 15 families contributed seeds. Some grew tall, some crooked. One kid planted his upside down, but they're all there, bright, unashamed, defiant in their own way, just like we became. And every once in a while, when the breeze moves just right, I swear I can still hear Lydia's voice carried on the wind, usually something like, "That shade of yellow is not HOA approved." We laugh, we plant more, and for the first time in a long time, we grow without fear. Sometimes standing up to petty power isn't just about proving a point. It's about protecting the peace for everyone who's too tired, too busy, or too afraid to fight back. Lydia thought her clipboard gave her control, but what she never understood was that true authority comes from trust, not fear. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was about resilience, about a quiet man who knew the law, knew his rights, and waited patiently for the truth to bloom like a sunflower on the edge of a storm. And when the storm passed, what remained wasn't bitterness, but a stronger, kinder community. So if you've ever felt steamrolled by a Karen in a power vest, remember this. The best revenge isn't screaming louder. It's knowing you're right, standing your ground, and letting karma do the yelling. Drop your own HOA horror story in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if this hit home.